All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nonprofit Enthusiasts Live. We are so excited to be back with you all this week. Last week, we had Dana Litwin who joined us and we talked about volunteer management. And this month, we continue that conversation. And today we have Carolyn, who I'll kind of talk a little bit more about her in a few, who I'm excited to have join us so we can continue the conversation on volunteer management, volunteer engagement this month. So if you are here, go ahead and let us know that you're here in the chat. Hi, Dolly. Hey, Shay. Good morning, everyone. Let us know that you're here. Go ahead and tag some friends into the chat box so that they can tune into this conversation. You definitely don't want to miss it. Volunteer management is a very important conversation for nonprofit organizations, and I'm glad that we're able to have these conversations this month. Before we get started, I just want to say a special thank you to Prosperous Partners, who is a global personnel and organizational consulting firm that seeks to develop innovative solutions to complex problems. We want to thank them for sponsoring us this month and allowing us to have these conversations. So we'll go ahead and drop their information in the chat box. Please make sure that you check them out. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Carolyn, I'm so excited to have you on. So just so you all know, so as you all know, I have a nonprofit organization, Love Our Youth. And when Carolyn came into our lives has been changed. One of the things that she came on as a volunteer and assisted us with is setting up our volunteer process. Well, I should say developing a system for our volunteer process, which is absolutely amazing. When volunteers come in, we just send them to our website and it takes care of everything else from there. So I'm so excited to have her on today to kind of talk about volunteers as a whole, volunteer engagement. So Carolyn, thank you so much for coming today. And if we could just start out by you just telling us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you so much, Lashina, and thank you for having me today, and welcome everyone. I'm really excited to talk about volunteer engagement and how this will be helpful to anyone here. If you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I will also be leaving my contact information at the end if you're interested in staying in touch or have any additional questions about this very interesting topic. So yeah, as Lashina mentioned, Caroline, I'm currently the volunteer engagement and experience manager at Start Small, Think Big. We're also a nonprofit organization really dedicated to advancing equity and inclusion in entrepreneurship with a focus on communities of colors and women. And so the whole model of the organization is that we connect those entrepreneurs with a network of skill-based volunteers that then provide them with free technical assistance across legal, marketing, and finance. And so in that capacity and my day-to-day role, we engage with over 2,000 volunteers on an annual basis. So that's a pretty large volume of volunteers. And those volunteers sometimes are just individual volunteers. They come from a place where they're looking to give back. They want to leverage their skill set, their expertise. And we also work a lot with corporate partners and law firm partners that are looking to engage their employees in volunteer opportunities. And so outside of this professional scope, as Lashina mentioned, I'm also myself a skill-based volunteer for Love Our Youth, and that's how we got connected and we have the opportunity to work on some amazing and exciting projects. So that was a little bit more about myself. One thing that I will say and how I came to this volunteer engagement field, I've always been working in the nonprofit sector since I got started. That's definitely something stamped in my family, especially on my mom's side, where everyone is pretty much working in the social services sector in general. So it felt like a very natural fit to me and a very natural career path. I've had the opportunity to work and volunteer with several organizations supporting people with disabilities, older adults, younger kids, and more recently, entrepreneurship with Start Small. And I really found my way to volunteer engagement after moving to New York several years ago. As you can probably guess, I'm not originally from New York, I'm from France. But when I moved here, I really became an active and dedicated volunteer myself for several organizations. I took the lead and became team leader for organization in New York. And that's really how I saw myself to be a good fit for this work in general and to apply my nonprofit management background and skills to volunteerism and to this field in general. And so since then, I definitely became passionate about volunteerism. I could talk about it for hours and really all about engaging with volunteers to provide them with meaningful experiences. So that's really a little bit more about myself.
Awesome. Carolyn, I did not know that you managed over 2,000 volunteers as a part of your volunteer program. That is
Yeah.
absolutely amazing. Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about this month's, like dive deeper into the topic of volunteer management or volunteer engagement. What are
Mhm.
some tips that you have for nonprofit organizations when it comes to their volunteer programs?
Yeah. So one thing that I will say and that I really enjoy talking about, and I think that's definitely key for organizations, is one aspect around building a volunteer engagement strategy. And so when I refer to a volunteer engagement strategy, it's really about being intentional about volunteer engagement, how we approach this work, and how for organizations to really invest in volunteer engagement and what that means. This is definitely one of my favorite topics ever when it comes to volunteer engagement. This is also honestly a topic that is becoming the center of more and more conversations in the field, which is a great sign. We're seeing some initiatives, including more research, more data on volunteer engagement, how organizations partner and develop their volunteer programs. One thing that I will mention is that you may have heard of the recent initiative for strategic volunteer engagement. And Lashina, if you have the link, feel free to drop
Oh,
that in the
yes.
chat. I won't go over this today, but I think this is a very interesting initiative and something that could be helpful for any organizations to look at their report, their data, and just get some information on that. I won't go over this today in details, but I was hoping today that we could talk a little bit more about what it means to build a volunteer engagement strategy for an organization and how it can look like in practice. Because I know sometimes when you refer back to strategy, it feels like very high level. So kind of like demystify a little bit this strategic piece and see what that means in practice for an organization. Um, so I think one really interesting thing about this topic is that sometimes when nonprofit organizations are getting started with a volunteer program or when they already have one in place, it can be a little tempting to start with some very operational aspects of volunteerism. And so when I say this, that can be, for example, that's an organization. We are helping clients and having a friendly visiting program, for example. And so you might want to say, well, we know we need volunteers to help us run this program, right? We need volunteers to go out and be matched with clients so they can visit them on a regular basis. And so for that, once you know, well, you need volunteers to help you run this program, you might be saying, well, great, let's get started. Let's create a recruitment flyer. Let's start posting in local communities. Let's start posting on Volunteer Match. Let's create a volunteer handbook. I think
Mhm.
those tools and materials are definitely important because you need them to run the program ultimately. Um, but it's so much bigger than just having a volunteer handbook or recruitment flyer. So I think that's one thing. And also sometimes for organizations, and that might speak to some people here, part of the conversation, it's you don't necessarily have someone dedicated to volunteer engagement in your organization. Or sometimes you have someone doing 5-10% volunteer engagement, but then this person is also doing communications, operations, community engagement. So it can be like a very large umbrella. And that makes sense for a whole lot of reasons. Sometimes you don't necessarily have the budget to have someone 100% focused on volunteer engagement. But sometimes it just creates additional challenges in the way you're going to be thinking about this volunteer engagement piece. Because once you have that, what I will say is that you might be building a roof and walls for your house, but not necessarily building this foundation that will set you up for success. And I think, Lashina, I probably mentioned that several times. At least that's something that people hear on a very regular basis at my organization, about like this parallel that I do between volunteer engagement and the house. I always make this analogy, and I really like that because it's like a house. Like sometimes you can have the roof and the walls in place. You will be protected against some of the external elements, the cold, the rain. But if you don't have ultimately this strong foundation, and then your house, meaning your organization, is being shaken during challenging times like we saw during COVID, this is where you realize, well, you might be missing some pieces in your house and you might be missing the foundation. And so that might not help you go very far in this process. And so I think this is really when you realize you need a strong foundation for volunteer engagement, especially when volunteers are mission critical for your organization. So that's really like the key around building this foundation and why you need that.
That's awesome. And I love the analogy of the house as well. And that's something that I use. I use house and food as my two comparisons that I love to use. And you're right. If you don't have a solid, you can have the roof, you can have the walls, but if you don't have that solid foundation, your program is going to break. And you're right. During the pandemic, I even know with our own organization, during the pandemic, a lot of houses were tested, right? That whether you're going to be able to stand or whether you're going to be able to continue. And there's other things that continue to happen within organizations that can, or I should say within the sector itself, that can impact your volunteer program. So that's why it's crucial for us to take this time. And yes, we condensed it into a month, but it's really crucial for your organization to invest in building your volunteer program. So thank you, Caroline. I just want to kind of throw that in.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's definitely, you might think like, obviously, especially when you get started with a volunteer program and you want volunteers to come in, it can be, really about, well, let's rush, let's get people into the door and then we'll figure things out. While I think it's really key to take a deep breath before, kind of pause and say, how do we want to bring those people on board? And how are we measuring the success of this partnership with volunteers? Because that will avoid many challenges. Because I think when you're not overall strategic about volunteer engagement, you might still attract people because people are looking to volunteer, they're willing to give back to their communities. Will they stick around? Not so sure, because they might quickly realize that this is not super organized, that maybe if you're a part of a volunteer services department, yeah, sure, maybe that person is really paying attention to volunteers, but that doesn't mean that all the people and all the staff members that are at some point engaging with volunteers will pay the same attention. And so I think that's where you can see that the house is being shaken, is that if you don't have this foundation, ultimately volunteers will realize that something is not going as well as they thought it will be in terms of their volunteer experience. And they will probably start looking somewhere else and just leave the organization. Because ultimately we see that a lot happening. So I think it's really like key for organizations to be strong about this and have this foundation. So then it really helps people to understand what that means. And I will definitely go over some benefits of having a volunteer engagement strategy, because that's one of them.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. I love it. I love it. And also I love, and I know you're going to kind of talk about the a little bit more about the volunteer engagement strategy, but I love um the fact of an organization making sure that they have one, and that we're talking about this. Do you have some sort of volunteer engagement strategy in place? Because otherwise your volunteers will walk in the door and walk right back out. And
Yes.
you'll have very low retention rates, and sometimes you're using a lot of energy on volunteers, but they're leaving because you don't have a system, a process, a lot of those things I like to talk about in place to kind of keep these volunteers engaged on an ongoing basis, so that they want to stay and be a part of your mission, continue to support the organization as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think it's, and again, I will go into like more details and in practice what it can look like, especially using my own example with the organization that I work with. But I think it's really this whole idea of volunteer engagement should be one of the key pillars of an organizational strategy and goals. And so when you have a volunteer program, if you have a volunteer program, ultimately you should have goals for this volunteer program, and those goals should connect and ladder up to the organizational goals and help achieve them. That's really like how the house should be
Mm-hmm.
built. It's the top of the house, under the roof, you have your organizational goals, and then volunteer program, you will need goals. You can't run a volunteer program just saying, well, we need volunteers, let's do interviews, let's give them a volunteer handbook. You need this vision past the short term, to really like sustain volunteer involvement. Because when that happens, when you have a volunteer engagement strategy in place, there are many benefits to it. And I think we talked about this retention piece. That's a really good one, because that will help you attract and engage with volunteers in meaningful ways. Volunteers will understand why they're here, why they volunteer with their organization, the impact that they're making. And they will really see that they're part of the organization. And ultimately, that's where you want to get. You don't want to use volunteers and tell them, well, we need volunteers to run this program. We need 10 of you, 10 of you. You need people to really feel part of the organization and know that you're all walking in the same direction. So I think that's definitely key, that will help you attract, keep volunteers. And if you don't keep volunteers for the long run, which also happens because people have busy lives and they can tell you, well, I'm happy to volunteer for a few months, but then I might not be available. As long as they have a stellar volunteer experience, I will say it doesn't matter, because someone going in, having a wonderful experience, feeling valued and appreciated for the work that they do, even if they tell you, I can no longer volunteer with your organization, they will be the first one going out and talking about your organization, saying how great this organization is, and encouraging everyone to give back and come to you if they're looking to volunteer. So ultimately, they're still staying in the ecosystem, which I think
Mm-hmm.
is definitely a great benefit of this. One other thing that I will mention also, when you have, or like when you build a volunteer engagement strategy, that definitely helps you to align the staff members and get buy-in across the board. Because in that sense, when you're building this volunteer engagement strategy for the organization, volunteer engagement then becomes a shared responsibility. So you might have someone dedicated and running this volunteer program, this volunteer services department, but ultimately, as you can probably know, we all engage with volunteers at some point in their journey. So maybe this person running the volunteer services department is the first point of contact for volunteers. Maybe they're the ones leading interviews and informational calls, but then ultimately, then they will probably work with a staff member. If I take again this example of the friendly visiting program, they might work with someone else from the social services in the organization. And this person needs to understand what the volunteer is doing, how impactful this person can be for the organization, and really see the bigger picture and understand how to engage with volunteers, which is definitely very different from engaging with volunteers. So I think it's just like helping you to get buy-in across the board. That's really key. And again, as I mentioned, another benefit when you have the volunteer engagement strategy, it's really about sustaining volunteer engagement and volunteer involvement in your organization, because that helps you create those goals and that vision for the long run and really say, we have a direction. We know we're going in that direction. By this date, we want to increase the number of volunteers. We want to maybe create additional volunteer opportunities that just like help you guide and see the direction you're going. And ultimately, that will help you achieve the organization goals and create impact, because we're all here for that, to create impact and for everyone to get something out of this experience, for the organization, for the volunteers. It's really this mutual partnership and relationship that we see.
I love that. And I love that you talked about volunteer engagement is a shared responsibility. So even though you have someone overseeing your volunteer program, they, when they leave that person and go into whether it's your marketing department or your human resource, depending on wherever they're volunteering or supporting, it's also the responsibility of the staff members on those teams to make sure that they engage and keep the volunteers engaged as a part of that process. So I love that you talked about it not just being just the volunteers manager responsibility, but also those within the organization when working with volunteers. And also, I love how you talked about even if the volunteer leaves, and we know that volunteers are sometimes, well, not sometimes, a lot of time turn into potential donors for organizations. And not only that, you talked about how they help spread the word and spread the mission. So even whether they're with the organization or no longer with the organization, when they have a really good experience, they keep that going. So and they'll think about you when opportunities come up in the community, which is amazing and priceless. And I've seen it happen. Even recently, we got like 2 phone calls of volunteers who no longer volunteer with us, but their jobs are doing company matches, and they're like, I want to give to, Love Our Youth. And on top of it, my company is going to match it. So they're still thinking about you and ways to support you, even though their time may be limited and they can't be there as frequent as they used to be. So I love that you talked about those things.
Yeah, I think that definitely helps a lot. It's really helping volunteers to build the connection to the organization and for them to really understand the mission, the work that they do, and also about building relationships like with you, with other staff members, because that will keep them around. And in some ways, they will always come back as like donors. Maybe you never know, someone might be getting a new job and then they reach out to you and say, hey, we're interested in becoming a corporate partner and we can bring you employees who might be volunteering for your organization. I think it's really about, providing this wonderful experience and building that connection. And once you have that, people will just stick around in some ways. So I think that's, that's really a good example. And I love that. And I think in practice, just like when you think about this volunteer engagement strategy, I mean, obviously I went over some theoretical thing, but in practice, that's something that you can do. It's not something like very on top of the word. And I will give you definitely a few ideas and tips here from the work that I've recently done at my organization and other organizations. So hopefully this is helpful. And again, if you have some questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, because I know sometimes when we talk about this strategy piece, it can be like very head heavy in some ways. But don't worry, that's something that you can do, like even if you're a small organization. I think to do this work and be intentional about volunteer engagement and build the strategy, I will start by saying that having someone dedicated to volunteer engagement who has the expertise in this field is really key, or at least someone willing to get support, because some organization may not have the budget, again, as I said, to have someone fully dedicated to volunteer engagement, but maybe you have a budget to get a consultant to help you build that strategy, which I think is definitely helpful. I will mention here the certification in volunteer administration. I know Dana, who was there last week, is also certified in volunteer administration. I am myself certified in volunteer administration. And if you look at the 7 core competencies that volunteer managers or administrators should have and be able to demonstrate, planning for strategic volunteer engagement is one of them. So that's definitely something that you should have, or at least someone who has the knowledge in this, because that's part of our job when it comes to managing and engaging with volunteers. And once you have that person, and again, from my experience and the work that I've done, one thing that was really helpful before creating anything related to strategy and building like a strategic document was really to do an assessment and kind of like a SWOT analysis, where you need to understand the current state of volunteer engagement. What is working, not working, if you're seeing that many people are coming on board, but then leaving the organization very quickly. And so this assessment, I will definitely encourage you to be qualitative and quantitative assessment. So really taking the time to talk to volunteers and clients and partners and staff members really across the board to identify major areas of improvement and start creating your roadmap for volunteer engagement. And once you have identified those areas of improvement, one thing that I use in my organization is this theory of change concept to really frame the vision and help link what we plan to do, the objectives, to what we're trying to achieve in terms of goals and intended outcomes, and ultimately impact, of course, while incorporating also external and internal factors. Like COVID will be, for example, a good external factor to your organization that will definitely influence your volunteer engagement strategy. And I think like that's a helpful tool, just to have a visual representation of this volunteer engagement piece. And then from there, you naturally create your action plan and say, that's my action plan for maybe the next 2 years. You don't need to plan for the 10 next years, because we never know what's going to happen, but at least having those goals for the next 2 or 3 years, and then knowing exactly who you need to be involving in these goals to make sure that you achieve them, and really like use this volunteer engagement plan to drive your strategy on a day-to-day basis. And I think for staff, that can be helpful, just to have this vision and have this tool to pilot the change.
Love it. Oh my gosh, I love the information that you are sharing. And I hope that you all are finding this information useful, especially if no matter whether you're an organization that has a volunteer program up and running, or if you're in your organization trying to figure out, well, what is my volunteer program going to look like? And I thank you, Carolyn, for sharing this information. It's been really, really good. And I love that you talked about again. And the thing that amazes me is last week Dana was on, and then you all are saying the same thing. And I don't know about those of you watching, but if I hear something constant, like for instance the strategic volunteer engagement initiative that you and I know that's something Dana touched on as well. I'm like, okay, I need to go read that report and see how that can support my volunteer program. So there's a lot of things that I love that you're sharing as well, that it's kind of like, oh yeah, if we haven't thought about this, we need to think about this and see how we can implement that within our organization. So I love it.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. And Karina said, great session. Thank you, Karina. Thank you for tuning in. Awesome. So anything else? And I know you shared a lot of wonderful information, Carolyn. I appreciate you for sharing that. If you have questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat box. As I mentioned, every month we have a different theme. This month is volunteer management. And if you're like, I don't know where to focus within my organization right now, follow our theme. So make this month, your goal is to assess your volunteer program and then tune into these sessions and take some of the tips and implement them within your organization. So if you have questions, go ahead and make sure that you drop those questions in the chat box. Anything else, Carolyn, that you would like to share before we wrap up for
yeah, that was definitely a high view. And again, as I said, this is a topic that we should probably spend hours and hours on it. But yeah, I think just for organizations to encourage everyone to be strategic about this, to provide a great volunteer experience, and just to have a solid plan in place, so you can leverage volunteers in a meaningful way. And as I said, it's a mutual relationship. It's really for them to feel also like valued and appreciated for for what they do and get something out of this experience. And for you as an organization to have volunteers help you achieve your goals.
Love it. Yep. And volunteers are such an asset to an organization. And if you don't have volunteers working within your organization, which I'm sure you do at some level, because you remember your board is a group of volunteers. You may have interns coming into your organization. So definitely taking a look at how can we leverage. And a lot of times I find, especially like organizations may have the same people doing wearing so much different hats. And if you find that your organization is there, let's say, I don't know, example, let's say I'm the marketing person, I'm the person facilitating the program, and I'm the person recruiting the volunteers, right? How awesome would that be if I had a volunteer that helped with the marketing? Or, so those are areas where you can invite different volunteers in to support you and kind of lift some of those things off of the team members. And the reason why I kind of say that is because I know, like, sometimes I hear organizations saying, hey, we got too much going on, or we're overloaded, we're overwhelmed. And there is a volunteer with the expertise in the area that I guarantee can help you in a certain area. They might volunteer with you, I don't know, like sometimes 20 hours a month and help you with developing your social media plan or something like that. But they can help support in different areas within your organization. And I know Carolyn will reiterate this point. Remember, your volunteers is not your staff, but there are certain pieces that volunteers can help with, because you also have to be careful when it comes to that as well. The line between volunteer versus putting staff demands on volunteers as well. So keeping that in mind as well. But anything else, Carolyn, before we close out for today?
No, that was it. Lashina, thank you so much for having me today. And I was really excited to talk about this topic. And yeah, as I said, feel free to share my email address in the chat if people want to stay in touch, have any additional questions, because I know I covered some of the aspects around volunteer engagement strategy, but there is definitely a lot more to it. So if you're interested in learning more, feel free to send me an email, and I will be happy to answer your questions and get the conversation going.
And do you mind saying your email, Carolyn?
Sure.
For those watching?
Yes. So that's Caroline, my first name, .enj.j@gmail.com.
enj.j@gmail.com. So
Yes.
carolyn.enj.j@gmail.com. And I'll also share that in the chat box so that you all have it. So thank you once again, Carolyn, for tuning in. Thank you all
Thank
for
you.
tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you all next week. All right. Bye, everyone.